I never thought one night could change everything. He was my best friend. The one person I'd trusted the most. We laughed. We talked about everything, but we were just friends. At least that's what I thought. Until that night. Until the moment he looked at me differently. Until he told me what he wanted. And when I finally gave in, there was no turning back. Some nights you don't realize your life is about to change. You don't see the moment coming. You don't feel the ground shifting beneath you until suddenly nothing is the same anymore. And for me, that moment happened with my best friend. His name was Ben Carter. We had been best friends for years. Inseparable, unbreakable, untouchable. At least that's what I thought. Until that night. Until the second he looked at me differently. It started out like any other night. Ben crashed at my place after a long week. Nothing unusual. We had done this 100 times before. Movie nights, late night conversations, beers on the couch. But something felt different. Something in the air. Something I didn't want to name. We sat side by side. The glow of the TV flickering against the walls. I wasn't even paying attention to the movie anymore because Ben was too close. And for the first time I noticed it. The way his knee pressed against mine. The way his breath hitched every time I moved. The way his fingers tapped restlessly against his jeans. Like he was thinking too hard about something. And then finally he spoke. "You ever think about doing something crazy?" he asked. His voice lower than usual. I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. Like, what? Ben hesitated. Then softer this time. Like changing everything. My stomach tightened. It was the way he said it. The way his voice dropped just slightly. Like this wasn't just a random question. Like he had been thinking about it for a while. Like he was waiting for my reaction. I swallowed. Ben. His gaze locked onto mine. Serious. Intense. Unshakable. And that's when I knew this wasn't a joke. The air between us shifted. The tension thickened. Stretched tight. Ben was still looking at me like he was waiting for permission to say what he really wanted to say. And then finally. Carefully. "I want to try something." My pulse spiked. "Try what?" I asked. My voice steady. Too steady. Ben exhaled slowly. Then without breaking eye contact. He reached for my hand. His fingers brushed against mine. Tentative but intentional. And suddenly the room felt too small. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. I swallowed hard. Because I should have said something. Should have laughed it off. Should have pulled my hand away. But I didn't. I just sat there staring at him. My heart pounding. Because this wasn't a joke. This wasn't just some drunken idea. This was Ben, and he was serious. Then softer this time. "Just let me." And before I could stop him, before I could think, Ben leaned in, and everything changed. Ben's lips barely brushed against mine. But it was enough. Enough to send a shiver down my spine. Enough to make my heart pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. Enough to destroy everything we had in a single second. Or maybe it was about to create something new. I didn't move, didn't pull away, didn't even breathe. I just sat there frozen. My best friend's face inches from mine. Waiting for me to stop him. Waiting for me to kiss him back. And the worst part, I didn't know which one I wanted to do. Ben swallowed hard. His fingers still wrapped around mine. His grip tightening just slightly. I could feel the heat radiating off him. See the way his chest rose and fell too fast. Like this moment, this risk, was suffocating him. And yet he wasn't pulling away. Neither was I. "You're not saying anything," he murmured. I blinked, my mouth dry, because I don't know what to say. Ben exhaled sharply. Like that was the one answer he didn't want to hear. His fingers twitched against mine. Then quieter this time. "Tell me to stop, and I will." I should have said it. I should have pulled away. Laughed it off. Pretended like this wasn't happening. But the way he was looking at me. Like he had been waiting for this. Like he had been wanting this. Like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. Made it impossible to say no. I licked my lips, swallowing hard. And then instead of answering, I did something worse. I leaned in. Ben's breath hitched. His fingers tightened around mine. And for the first time I saw it. The hesitation. Like he had never actually believed I would let this happen. Like he had been prepared for rejection. But now there was nothing stopping us. The distance between us disappeared. Ben's lips brushed against mine again. This time with purpose. Slow, careful, like he was memorizing the moment. Like he was afraid of ruining it. But it was already ruined. And I wasn't stopping. I kissed him back. I felt his fingers dig into my skin, pulling me closer. I felt his breath stutter against mine. like he couldn't believe this was happening. I felt the weight of everything we had built as friends shifting into something else. Something we weren't ready to name. But we weren't stopping. Not now. Not anymore. Then a noise. The front door creaked. We both froze. Ben's eyes went wide. Reality slammed back in. And suddenly the moment was over. Ben pulled away fast, his breathing ragged. I ran a hand through my hair, my pulse still racing. We just sat there staring at each other, neither of us knowing what the hell to say. Then, after a long pause, Ben laughed softly, shaking his head. "Well," he muttered, his voice hoarse, "that just happened." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah," I whispered. "It did. And the worst part, I wanted it to happen again." Ben and I sat there staring at each other. The air was thick between us, charged, like the moment hadn't really ended, just paused. But the sound of the front door had been enough to snap us back to reality, to remind us of what we had just done. And worse, what we wanted to do again. Ben licked his lips, running a hand through his already messy hair. "Okay," he muttered, more to himself than me. I swallowed hard, my pulse still thumping in my ears. "Okay," I echoed. His gaze flicked to mine, sharp, intense. "Yeah, that just happened." I exhaled a shaky breath. "Yeah," I whispered. "It did. And the worst part, I didn't regret it." Ben let out a slow breath, his fingers still gripping his jeans like he was holding himself together. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. I should have said no. Should have laughed it off. Turned the whole thing into a joke. But instead I hesitated. And that was enough. Ben's lips parted slightly, like he had just gotten the answer he didn't expect. Like he had hoped for it but didn't believe it would actually happen. The tension stretched between us. A silent, undeniable pull. And when he shifted slightly closer, I felt it again. The heat, the gravity, like we were on the edge of something dangerous. Something we couldn't come back from. And the crazy part, I wanted to jump. Ben's fingers brushed against mine. Soft, hesitant, testing, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I turned my hand over, letting my fingers lace with his. His breath hitched. And in that moment I knew we weren't just messing around. This wasn't some drunken mistake. This was real. And that scared the hell out of me. Ben swallowed hard, his thumb tracing slow, careful circles over my skin. "You're thinking too much," he murmured. I let out a soft laugh. Breathless, shaky. "You're not thinking enough." Ben smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Maybe I don't want to think." And just like that, the moment shifted again. His free hand reached up, barely grazing my jaw. A test, a warning, a promise. And then softer this time. "Let me kiss you again." My breath caught, because this time he wasn't making the first move. He was waiting for me to do it, for me to choose it. And for the first time I realized I already had. I leaned in. Ben met me halfway. And when our lips crashed together, there was no hesitation, no second guessing, no thinking about what came next. Just him. And for the first time in my life I didn't want to stop. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't some impulsive moment we could laugh off tomorrow. This was something else, something real, something I had been running from without even realizing it. And now I couldn't run anymore. Ben kissed me like he was making up for lost time. Time like he had been waiting for this. Like he had spent years wanting something he thought he could never have. And now that he did, he wasn't going to let it slip away. His hand slid up my arms, gripping, pulling me closer, like he was afraid I'd disappear. Like he needed to prove that I was real. And the craziest part, I felt the same way. I had spent so long not thinking about him like this, not letting myself see what was right in front of me. But now there was no denying it. Because my body knew what my mind refused to admit. That this was exactly where I was meant to be. Ben pulled back just enough to look at me. His chest rose and fell too fast. His fingers still gripping my shirt. His lips were red, swollen, ruined. And when his eyes met mine, for the first time I saw it. Fear, not of what we had just done, but of what it meant. He swallowed hard. "We can't go back from this," he murmured. I exhaled slowly, my heart hammering. "I don't want to." His grip tightened, like he had been waiting for me to say it. Like he needed me to say it. And then softer this time. "Then don't stop me." I didn't. I kissed him again. Because this was already ours. The night stretched on, blurring into something unstoppable, inevitable. And when we finally collapsed into each other, breathing hard, skin warm from the weight of what we had done. There was no doubt left. No question. No regret. Only the feeling of Ben's arms wrapped around me. Like he never planned to let go. Like he never wanted to let go. And maybe neither did I. The room was dark, but I didn't need light to know he was still there. Ben's slow, steady breaths filled the quiet space between us. His arm was draped over my waist. Like he didn't even realize he was still holding on to me. Like he couldn't help it. And the worst part, I didn't want him to let go. I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning. How had we gotten here? How had one moment, one kiss, led to something neither of us could take back? Something I wasn't sure I wanted to take back? But the real question was, what happens now? Ben shifted beside me, his grip tightening slightly. Still awake? He murmured, his voice low and rough. I swallowed hard. Yeah. Silence. Then softer this time. You regret it? I turned my head, meeting his gaze in the dim light. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they weren't. They were searching, like he was bracing himself for the answer. Like he already knew what I was going to say. And maybe I did too. I exhaled slowly, my heart thumping. No. Ben's breath caught, like he hadn't expected me to admit it. Like he had been preparing for the opposite. His fingers traced absently over my arm. Light, hesitant, then quieter this time. Me neither. That should have been enough. Should have been all I needed to hear. But instead I wanted more. I wanted to know what this meant. If it was real. If it was going to last. Because there was no coming back from this. Not for me. Not for him. Not anymore. I swallowed. So what happens now? Ben exhaled, rolling onto his back. That's the question, isn't it? Silence stretched between us. Then softer this time. Do you want this? His voice was steady, controlled, but his fingers were still gripping the sheets. Like he was bracing for impact. Like he was terrified of my answer. And maybe I was too. I turned toward him, my fingers finding his. And when I finally spoke, no hesitation, no doubt. Yeah, I murmured. I do. Ben's breath hitched. His grip tightened. And in that moment I knew we weren't stopping. Not now. Not ever. Ben didn't say anything right away. But I could feel his reaction. The way his breath caught. The way his fingers tightened around mine. Like he had been waiting for me to say it. Like he had been hoping. And now that he knew the truth, there was no turning back. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with uncertainty. It was thick with understanding. With something real. Something neither of us had planned. But neither of us could ignore anymore. And when Ben finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You mean that? I swallowed, my heart pounding. Yeah, I murmured. I do. Ben let out a slow, shaky breath. Then before I could process it, he moved, rolled over, closing the space between us. His fingers tangled with mine. His forehead rested against mine. And when he kissed me, soft this time, slower, like he was memorizing the moment, I knew this wasn't just some impulse, some reckless mistake. This was us, and it had been all along. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow. Didn't know if the world would accept us. Didn't know if people would understand. But right now none of that mattered. Because for the first time in my life I wasn't running. I wasn't second-guessing. I wasn't afraid. I was exactly where I was meant to be. With him. Ben pulled back just enough to look at me. His thumb brushed over my cheek. His gaze soft. Sure, certain. We'll figure this out, he murmured. I exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at my lips. Together? Ben smirked. Together. And when he kissed me again, I knew we were never looking back. Love doesn't always follow the rules. Sometimes the person you were meant to be with was right in front of you all along. What would you do if your best friend became something more? Let me know in the comments, and if this story kept you hooked. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications for more stories that make you feel something.